boundary stone stood at the low end of the water meadow, where the river ran slow, and the ground kept the print of every winter flood, and it had stood there longer than anyone now living could account for. It was a plain block of grey stone, waist-high, weathered soft at the corners, and on its northern face 2 marks had been cut, an old N, and beside it an old P, deep once and shallow now, worn nearly smooth by 200 seasons of rain. No one who walked the meadow could any longer say what the 2 letters had meant, or why they had been cut together on the same stone, as though the 2 houses they stood for had once meant to be joined rather than divided. The meadow itself was the richest ground for a mile in either direction. Deep grass, good water, the sort of land that fattened cattle and made men careful. It lay exactly between 2 estates, and both of them claimed it, and neither of them had walked it in peace in living memory. On the far bank rose the chimneys of Ravenley, seat of the Dukes of Norbrook, grey and enormous against the hills. On the near bank, smaller and older and shabbier, stood Whitecroft, where the Netmonts had lived since before there were dukes at Ravenley at all. Between the 2 houses ran the river, and in the river lay the meadow, and in the meadow stood the stone, and the stone was the whole quarrel carved small. Men had died with the quarrel unsettled. Money enough to have drained the marsh and rebuilt both houses had gone instead to lawyers in a suit that had outlived the men who began it. And still the 2 letters faced each other on the stone, N and P, waiting, it almost seemed, for someone to remember what they were for. Vivian Netmont walked the meadow most mornings, because it was hers, or ought to be, and because walking it was a way of refusing to concede it. She was 26, and she had run Whitecroft in her own name for 4 years, since the fever took her father, and the sea took her brother in the same hard winter, and the running of it had made her what she was. She was not a fashionable woman. She dressed for the work the land demanded, in stout boots and practical grey, and she carried her father's seal ring on a cord, because her hands were too thin for it, and she knew the name of every tenant on the estate, and the state of every roof. The county, which had expected her to fail, or to marry, or to sell, had been obliged to watch her do none of those things. She held the line. It was the only thing she knew how to do, and she did it well, and it was killing her by inches, though she would not yet have said so aloud. For the truth of Whitecroft, the truth she carried alone, was that the estate was dying. The mortgages had swallowed 2 farms already. The suit over the meadow, which her father had pursued, and his father before him, ate money every quarter and yielded nothing, and her man of business assured her, quarter after quarter, that they were close now, very close, that one more term would see the Norbrook claim broken, and the meadow theirs, and the tide turned. She had believed him for 4 years. She was beginning, that spring, not to believe him, and the not believing frightened her more than the debts did, because if the suit was not close, then she had spent her people's last money on nothing, and there was no line left to hold. She blamed the Duke of Norbrook for all of it. She had been raised to. Every Netmont was raised to. The Norbrook house had stolen the meadow 2 generations back, so the catechism ran, and had broken the family that owned it, and had ground the Netmonts down with law and money and cold aristocratic patience ever since, and the present Duke was only the latest and coldest of a cold line. She had never spoken to him. She had seen him twice at a distance, tall and correct and unmoved, and she had hated him with the clean inherited hatred of a woman who has been given an enemy the way other women are given a name. She did not question it. One does not question the ground one stands on. Across the river, that same spring, Richard Penfield, 5th Duke of Norbrook, was questioning a great many things. He was 35, and he had held the dukedom for 11 years, and he wore his correctness like a well-cut coat, because it was expected, and because it was useful, and because a man who shows nothing cannot be read. He was tall, with sandy fair hair, and eyes of a deep, clear blue that people found difficult to meet, and he had a reputation in the county for coldness that he had never troubled to correct, since coldness kept fools at a distance. What the county did not know was that the Duke of Norbrook had spent the winter reading very carefully the accounts of the suit his grandfather had begun, and that he had not liked what he found. The suit was not close. It had never been close. It could not be won. The thing it turned on, the right to the bride's meadow, rested on a survey neither side could produce, and a story neither side could prove. The lawyers on both banks of the river knew it, and had known it for years, and had gone on billing both houses for a victory that could not come. Richard had done the sum that no one before him had troubled to do. He had set the Norbrook costs beside what he could learn of the Netmont costs, and he had seen that the suit was not a war between two houses at all. It was a business, and its proprietors were the men of law, and its victims were the two families who paid them to keep it alive. He had also learned, that winter, a harder thing. Whitecroft was failing. He had not sought the knowledge with any pleasure, and he took none in it. He knew, because a duke who reads properly knows such things, that the Netmont mortgages were held now by men who would foreclose within the year, that the tenants were frightened, that the woman who ran the place was pouring the last of her money into a suit that would never pay. And some part of him, the part he did not show and scarcely admitted, could not look at it with the satisfaction his grandfather would have felt. His grandfather had wanted the Netmonts broken. Richard, reading the accounts by his cold study fire, found that he did not want it at all. He wanted the thing settled. He wanted the bleeding, on both banks, to stop. He said as much, one grey evening, to the only person in the world who dared to hear him say anything. Augusta, Dowager Duchess of Norbrook, was 81 years old, small and upright, and sharp as a hat-pin, and she had buried a husband and a son, and had opinions about everything, most of them correct. She had been a girl of 10 in the year the quarrel began, and she was the last living soul who had been in the house when it began. She had watched 3 generations of her family nurse it, and she had come, in her great age, to regard it as the stupidest waste she had ever been forced to witness. She listened to her grandson lay out the accounts. She looked into the fire for a while. And then she said the thing she had been waiting 11 years for the right moment to say. "There is a way to end it," she said, "that no one in either house will like, which is how I know it is the right one." Richard waited. He had learned, with his grandmother, to wait. "Marry the girl," said the dowager. He did not answer at once. "The suit ends the day you marry her," Augusta went on, unhurried, "because a man does not sue his own wife over a meadow that has become, by the marriage, the property of the joined house. The mortgages you can clear with a morning's work, and never miss the money. The tenants are saved. The meadow is joined to Ravenlay at last, which is what your grandfather wanted, though not by the road he would have chosen. And the feud, Richard, the whole long, stupid feud, dies for want of anyone left on two sides to fight it. There is only one house then. There is no war inside one house that both halves do not lose. She will not have me, Richard said. Her people have hated mine for 60 years. She has been taught to hate me since she could speak. She will have you, said his grandmother, because she is drowning, and you are the only rope, and she is far too clever to refuse a rope on account of who is holding the other end. She will hate you while she takes it. That is a different matter, and it will keep. The old woman looked at him with her bright old eyes. You think me cold. I am not cold. I am old, which looks the same from the outside, and is not the same at all. I have watched this family throw away 60 years, and a fortune, and at least 2 lives on a quarrel that need never have happened. I should like, before I die, to see it stop. And there is a thing about the beginning of it that neither house has ever known, that I have carried a long time, and that I will tell you when the moment is right, and not before. For now it is enough that you trust me. Marry the girl. End it. So the offer was made across the river, in the cold, correct language of a duke's man of business to a lady's man of business. And on the near bank, in the failing house, Vivian Netmont received it, and understood it, and did not for one moment mistake it for anything but what it was. She read the letter twice. Then she sat very still, for a long time, in her father's chair, in her father's study, with her father's ring cold against her breastbone, and she thought about what it meant. It meant the enemy had won. It meant that after 60 years of Netmont resistance, the last Netmont would carry the Norbrook name and give the Norbrook house the meadow, and everything else besides would hand across the river, in a single signature, the thing 3 generations had died refusing to yield. It was the bitterest cup she had ever been offered, and it was the only one that did not end with her tenants turned out on the road, and Whitecroft sold to strangers, and her father's people scattered. Her man of business, Mr. Frayne, was against it. He was strongly against it. He had been her father's man of business, and his father's before that, a soft-spoken, careful, greying man who had served the family faithfully, or so she had always believed, for 30 years, and he came to her the moment he heard of the offer, agitated in a way she had rarely seen him. You cannot consider it, Miss Netmont, he said. You cannot. Your father would turn in his grave. The suit is close, I have told you. 1 more term. To marry the man who has bled this family white, to give him the meadow with your own hand. It is not to be thought of. Let me press the suit. Let me find the money. There are always ways. What ways, Mr. Frayne? She asked. She was very tired. There have been no ways for 4 years. Tell me one. And she watched him, and something in his agitation did not match his words. Some fear underneath the loyalty that she could not name, and she filed it away without knowing why. The way she filed the state of a roof, or the look of a sick beast, because noticing was her habit and her trade. The night before the wedding, neither house slept easily, and neither knew it of the other. At Whitecroft, Vivian sat late in her father's study with a single candle. She had a letter half written to her brother's widow, who could not come, and she found she could not finish it, because every honest sentence she began turned into a confession she did not wish to make. She wrote that the marriage was a good bargain, and struck out the word good. She wrote that the Duke was not unkind, and struck out the whole line. In the end, she wrote only that the tenants would be safe now, and that their father would have understood, and she was not sure of either, and she sealed it anyway. Then she banked the study fire with her own hands, as she did every night, because there was no longer a servant to spare for it. She sat a while in the dying light with her father's ring cold in her fist. She did not weep. Weeping was a thing she had given up along with the farms. She was marrying the enemy in the morning, and she had told herself all the reasons 100 times, and they were good reasons, and they did not keep her warm. Across the river, at Ravenley, the Duke of Norbrook sat equally late, in a study 10 times the size, with a fire he need not tend, and a decanter he did not touch. He too had a letter before him, to a friend from his youth, the one man who had known him before the title. He too could not finish it. He wrote that he was doing a sensible thing for sensible reasons, and read it back, and found it a lie of omission, because it left the woman out entirely. The level grey gaze in the church porch, the frank, hard speech that had unbalanced him more than any softness could. He did not write about that. He did not have the words for it, or would not use them. He banked his own great fire himself, though a dozen servants would have done it, because banking a fire was one of the few honest small labours a duke was left. He stood a while at the tall window, looking across the dark valley to where a single light still burned at Whitecroft, and he wondered what she was thinking, and told himself it did not matter, and did not believe himself. 2 houses, 2 letters half written and set aside, 2 fires banked by the 2 hands that would be joined in the morning, 2 prides, nursed on opposite banks of the same river, each certain it was the wronged one, each lying awake over the same cold fact, and neither able to say, even alone, even to the dark, that it was afraid. She married the Duke of Norbrook 6 weeks later, in the small grey church that stood, as everything in that valley stood, between the 2 houses. She married him to save Whitecroft, and she told him so, in the one private conversation they had before the wedding, because she would not begin even this on a lie. "I want you to understand what this is," she said. They stood in the church porch, having met there by arrangement, both of them early, both of them, she suspected, for the same reason, which was to take the measure of the enemy without witnesses. He was taller than she had thought, and colder, and his blue eyes rested on her with a still attention that gave nothing back. "I am marrying you to save my people and my land, not for your name, which I do not want, and not for your money, which I would rather have earned, and not for any regard, because I have none and expect none. You are buying peace and a meadow. I am selling them because I have nothing else left to sell, and because the alternative is to watch families who have farmed my land for 200 years put out on the road. That is the whole of it. I will keep the bargain honestly. I will run your house as well as I run my own, because I do not know how to run anything badly. But I will not pretend to you ever that I came to you willingly, and I will thank you not to pretend otherwise to me. It was the longest speech anyone had made to the Duke of Norbrook in some years, and the frankest, and he received it in silence, looking at her, and she braced for the cold set-down of a man who held every card and knew it. It did not come. Instead he inclined his head, once, a small grave gesture that was almost, she thought later, a kind of respect. "I will not pretend," he said. "You are honest with me. I will be honest with you. I did not offer for you to win the meadow, whatever your people will say, and whatever mine will think. I offered because the suit is a fraud that has been robbing both our houses for 60 years, and I would rather end it than win it, and marriage is the only thing that ends it clean. You save your people. I stop the bleeding of mine. It is a bargain between equals, Miss Netmont, whatever the difference in our fortunes, and I will treat it as one, and I will treat you as one, and if I ever fail to, you have my leave to tell me so to my face. I am told you are good at that." She had not expected any of it. She had expected a cold conqueror, and she had been given a cold man who called her his equal, and meant it, and it unbalanced her more than cruelty would have done, because she had armed herself against cruelty, and had no armor ready for fairness. She said nothing. She went in and married him. And when the vicar joined their hands, the same hands that on the stone in the meadow were two worn letters facing each other across 60 years, she felt the ring go on. And she thought, with a clarity that frightened her, that she did not know this man at all, and that everything she did know had been given to her by people who had never spoken to him either. We'll take a very short break. If you don't want to miss new stories, please subscribe to the channel. The war did not end at the altar. It only changed its ground. The county came to the wedding, because a duke's wedding must be attended whatever the scandal of it, and the scandal of this one was very great. Half the guests had come to see a Netmont brought low, and half had come to see a duke throw himself away on a bankrupt neighbour, and all of them watched the bride with the particular attention people reserve for a woman they expect to break. She did not break. She stood through the breakfast at Ravenlay, in the great cold rooms of the house she had been taught to hate, among people who smiled at her over the rims of their glasses, and said cutting things in the pleasant voices of their kind. She met all of it with a level grey composure that gave them nothing to carry away. It was one of Richard's own relations who lit the first fire. A cousin of the Duke's, Sir Gerald, a florid, confident man who had drunk enough to be honest, said in Vivian's hearing, not quite to her, and not quite not, that it was a charming thing to rescue a fallen house, and that the meadow alone was near worth the encumbrance of the wife. The nearest guests laughed. Vivian felt the old clean hatred rise in her, and with it something new and worse, which was shame, the shame of the bought thing, the encumbrance standing in her enemy's hall in a gown her enemy had paid for. She was framing her reply, the cold, true reply that would cost her whatever it cost, when the Duke of Norbrook spoke first. He did not raise his voice. He never raised his voice. He said into the small silence, "You will apologize to the Duchess, Gerald." And the word Duchess landed in the room like a stone in a pond, because it was the first time anyone had used it. It named her his. It named the man who had insulted her a man who had insulted the Duke of Norbrook's wife in the Duke of Norbrook's house. "You will apologize now, and then you will have your carriage brought, because I find I do not want you under this roof tonight. The meadow is not worth the wife. Nothing I own is worth the wife. You have mistaken the bargain, as I see the rest of you have. Correct it." The cousin apologized, white about the mouth, and left. The room rearranged itself hastily into good behavior, and Vivian Netmont, Duchess of Norbrook, for the space of 1 hour, stood in the wreckage of the moment, and did not know what to feel. Her enemy had just defended her name more fiercely than any friend she had, and had done it not with warmth, which she could have dismissed, but with a cold, flat finality that she could not. She understood that she had been wrong about at least one thing, and being wrong about one thing meant she might be wrong about others, and that was the most disturbing thought she had had in years. They spoke of it that night, briefly, the only 2 people left awake in the great house when the guests had gone. "You need not have done that," she said. "I can defend myself. I have had a great deal of practice." "I know you can," he said. "I did it because it was true, not because you could not. He insulted my wife under my roof. A man answers that. It has nothing to do with whether the wife requires answering for." He looked at her across the cold hearth. "We are enemies, Duchess. I do not forget it, and I do not ask you to. But you are my wife, and my name is on you now, whether either of us wished it, and no one insults my name in my hearing. Not even," he added, and it was as near to dry humour as she would hear from him for a long while. "When the name has only been yours an afternoon, and you would give it back tomorrow if you could." "I would," she said. "I know," he said. "Good night, Duchess." That was the shape of the first months. They lived in the same great house, and were scrupulous strangers in it. Propriety was observed to the letter. Separate wings, separate hours, servants forever present. The whole architecture of the period's decorum turned into a wall between them that neither crossed. They met at dinner, at the near end of the long table, because Vivian had ordered the places laid so on the second night, and dared him with her eyes to object. And he had not objected, and neither of them ever spoke of it. They divided the work of 2 estates between them, with the wary efficiency of 2 commanders sharing a border. And they watched each other all the time, with the ceaseless attention of adversaries, and what each of them saw began, slowly, against the will of both, to undo what they had been taught. The great house did not welcome her. Ravenlair had been a bachelor duke's house for 11 years, correct and cold, and running like a clock, and it received its new mistress, the enemy's daughter, with a frost that rose from the servants' hall and settled over everything. The upper servants were scrupulously correct and privately appalled. Vivian felt it the first morning, and she knew the feeling well, because it was the same frost the county had turned on her for 4 years, the patient waiting to see her fail that she had outlasted at Whitecroft by the plain method of not failing. She did not fight it. She did what she had always done. She learned the house and the land under it. Within a fortnight, she knew the name of every servant, the state of every account, which of the Ravenlay tenants were behind, and where the west roof had leaked for 3 years, because no one had thought it their business to say. She did not scold, and she did not flatter. She proved day after day, that she was competent. And competence, in a great house, as on a small farm, is a thing that cannot be argued with for long. The turn came over a matter of the land, which was fitting, since land was the whole quarrel. 2 of the Ravenlay tenants had been feuding a season over a drainage ditch, a small, ugly business the Duke's agent had let fester because it was beneath his notice, and it had grown until the 2 families would not speak, and the standing water was ruining both their fields. Vivian heard of it, and rode out one grey morning and settled it before noon. She walked the ditch herself in her stout boots, found the true fault of it, which was neither man's, apportioned the cost of the mending fairly between them and the estate, and left 2 tenants shaking hands who had not spoken in months. She did it as a matter of course. It was the kind of thing she had done at Whitecroft every week of her life. But the Ravenlay people had never seen it done, because their Duke was correct, and their agent was idle, and the story went round the estate by nightfall. The new Duchess, the Netmont woman, knew more of their land in a morning than the agent had learned in 10 years, and had used the knowing to make peace between neighbours, rather than to take a side. The frost did not lift all at once, but it began, that week, to lift. And Richard heard of it too, and said nothing, and understood that his house was being taken from him, and given back to him better, by a woman raised to hate him, who mended his tenants' quarrels, because she did not know how to leave a quarrel unmended. It was, he thought, the level his own people and hers had made their peace on generations ago, the level of the ditch and the field and the standing water where the work was done. Only the masters, up in the cold, correct houses, had kept the war alive. She saw first that he was fair. It galled her to see it, and she saw it anyway, because she was too honest not to. He read her estate's accounts, which she had brought under the joined settlement, half expecting him to seize and mismanage them. And he read them properly, and he came to her, not to her steward, and treated her as the person who knew the land, which she was. He paid, without fuss, and without being asked, the damages owed to 3 boundary families, whose crops the suit's long neglect of the riverbank had ruined, damages her own side had argued for years, with the Norbrook fault and the Norbrook debt. He asked her which fields wanted draining first, and when she told him, he drained them in that order, because she had given him a reason, and the reason was good. He never once, in all those months, used his money or his name or his rank to overrule her on a matter of the land. When they disagreed, which was often, he argued the case on its merits, and yielded when her case was better, which it sometimes was. And he said so, which cost him something she could see him pay. He saw first that she was formidable. He had expected a proud, drowning woman clutching a lost cause, and he had married instead a land agent of the first order in a lady's grey gown. He learned it fully at the harvest. The weather broke wrong that year, a wet season, the wheat standing heavy and the rain coming on, and his own bailiff, a cautious town-bred man, gave the low fields up for spoiled. Vivian did not give them up. She rode out herself in the grey wet, and she called in the tenants of both estates, Netmont and Norbrook together, more hands than either house alone could raise, and she set them cutting in a single gang against the weather. She worked among them 3 brutal days, soaked through, her father's coat black with rain, and she got the wheat in, all of it, the hour before the true storm came down. Richard stood at the field edge and watched his tenants and hers take her orders without a murmur. They obeyed a Netmont woman in a wet grey gown because she was right and quick and unafraid, and he understood a thing that shamed him. His people and hers had made their peace across this river long ago, down at the level where the work was done, in the field and the flood and the harvest. It was only the masters, up in the cold houses, who had kept the war alive. He learned it again, differently, over the maps. They fell to arguing the meadow one evening in the estate office. The old surveys spread between them like a battlefield. He held that the disputed ground was worth the war for its grazing. She held that it was worth less than either house had ever thought, and she proved it. She showed him, with her finger on the old plan, a thing about the fall of the land and the run of the water that no Norbrook survey had ever caught. The meadow flooded 3 years in 5, and could never be the rich prize the quarrel had made of it. He looked at it a long moment. Then he conceded the point, plainly, because she was right, and he did not know how to pretend otherwise. And she did not gloat. She had argued the meadow, and never the man, as she always did, and he found that he respected her the more for winning, without wanting to wound, which was a thing he had not known a person could do in a war. They did not become friends. The whole grain of their raising forbade it. The long habit of the war forbade it. But respect grew where liking could not yet reach, and respect, in 2 people of their kind, was the harder currency, and the truer. There came a day when Vivian found herself, to her own great surprise, defending the Duke of Norbrook. She had ridden over to Whitecroft, as she did most weeks, to see her own people, and keep her own house in her own hands, for she had made it a condition of the marriage that Whitecroft remained hers to run. And Richard had agreed without a murmur, which was itself a thing she had not expected. She was in the kitchen at Whitecroft, among the people who had known her since she was a child, and old Martha, who had been her nurse and said what she liked, began on the Duke. She began the way the whole valley began on the Duke, calling him the cold thief across the water, the breaker of the family, the man who had bought their girl for a meadow. And Vivian, who had said all those things herself 100 times, who had been raised to say them, opened her mouth to agree, and found that she could not. "He is not a thief," she heard herself say. "Whatever else he is. He paid the Hallrow family for the crops the river spoiled, which our side owed and never paid, and never crowed about the paying. He reads a petition properly, and answers it fair. He has never once used his money against me, where the right of a thing was on my side, and I have given him the chance." She stopped, because Martha was staring at her, and she was rather staring at herself. "I do not say I like him. I say he is fair. There is a difference, and I will not have even him called what he is not in my own kitchen. We have told enough lies about that house for 60 years. I find I have no more taste for them." It went round Whitecroft within the day that the mistress had defended the Duke in her own kitchen, and it troubled her people, and it troubled her more, because she had not planned to say it. It had come out of her as truth comes out, without leave, and she rode back across the river that evening, knowing that something in her had shifted that she could not shift back. He had shifted too, in the same season, in his own way, and neither of them told the other. She learned only long after that, in the very week she defended his name at Whitecroft, he had quietly withdrawn a motion in the old suit, a motion his lawyers had pressed for years, that would have stripped a strip of the river bank from a Netmont tenant. He had walked the bank himself and seen that the tenant had the right of it, and he had let the claim go without a word to anyone, least of all to her. It was a small thing. It was the first concession, made not for her, who did not know of it, but because it was just. And she made her own, unknowing, the same month. She ordered her Whitecroft men to open the old sluice that fed the Ravenlay water meadows in a dry spell. It was water her father would sooner have let run to the sea than send across the river. She did it because the beasts on the far bank were suffering, and it was cruel to let them, and she told no one why. So the two small justices, his and hers, crossed the river that month in opposite directions, and neither knew of the others, and the ice that had stood between the houses for 60 years lost, that month, its first thin edge. She found out about the Hallrose by accident, and it shamed the whole war in a single afternoon. The Hallrose were a boundary family, a cottage, and a few acres that sat, as such families do, exactly on the disputed ground, belonging in truth to neither house and claimed by both. They had farmed there through the worst of the feud by the simple expedient of bowing to whichever master came, and troubling neither. Vivian had known them all her life. She had sent them meat in the hard winters, quietly, out of her own thin stores, because they sat on her side of the stone as she reckoned it, and a mistress looks after her own. What she had not known, what she learned only that afternoon from old Halrow himself, was that in those same hard winters the Duke of Norbrook had done exactly the same. He had sent them coal and meat from Ravenlay, quietly, out of his own great stores, because they sat on his side of the stone as he reckoned it. Each of the two enemies had kept the same family alive through the same winters, each in secret, each unknowing of the other, each certain the family was theirs to keep. "We never said, my lady," old Halrow told her, twisting his hat. "We never dared. If your house knew his was feeding us, or his knew yours, we feared to lose the both. So we held our tongues, and took the both, and blessed you both in our prayers, the same prayer, the same breath, for 60 year. It seemed to us down here there was no quarrel worth the name. There was only two great houses being kind to the same poor family, and swearing us to keep it secret from each other." He looked at her, an old man who had watched the war from underneath it. "We could have told you, my lady. Any of us down here could have told you. There was never but the one valley. It was only up there they ever thought there were two." Vivian rode home from the Hallrow cottage with her face burning, and she did not know whether she wanted to laugh or weep. It was the whole thing in miniature. 60 years of hatred, and underneath it the two haters quietly feeding the same family through the same winters, and hiding it from each other like a shame. That evening she told Richard, plainly, at the near end of the long table, and she watched him understand it as she had. Neither of them laughed. Neither of them quite could speak for a while. It was, she thought afterward, the moment they truly stopped being enemies, though the truth of the meadow was still to come. They had been shamed into peace by a family too poor to afford a feud. There was a night that neither of them planned, And neither of them forgot, some months in, when the respect first showed itself as something warmer. It was late, and Vivian could not sleep, and she went down to the estate office to look again at the accounts, because a small wrong figure had been troubling her for a week, a discrepancy in the suit's costs that she could not make balance. She found the Duke of Norbrook already there, a single candle lit, the same ledgers open before him, and she understood that the same small wrong figure had brought him down in the dark to the same table. They looked at each other across the ledgers. Then, without a word, she drew up a chair, and they worked through the night, the two of them, heads bent over the columns, the candle burning down, tracing the suit's costs back through the years. And what they found, as the sky greyed at the office window, was that the figures did not lie the way a losing suit lies. They lied the way theft lies. Money had gone out of Whitecroft, quarter after quarter, in the name of the suit, that had never reached any lawyer at all. It had gone somewhere. It had been going somewhere for years. And the only hand that had touched every one of those figures, on the Netmont side, the only man who had rendered every account and explained every shortfall and promised every term that victory was close, was Vivian's own trusted man of business, Mr. Frayne. She sat back from the ledger, and her face was white. Richard saw her understand it, saw the ground she had stood on all her life tilt under her. And he did the only thing there was to do, which was to say nothing, and let her have the terrible moment without an audience of comfort she had not asked for. She had blamed him, his house, for the ruin of hers. And the ruin of hers had been sitting at her own right hand for 30 years, in the person of the greying, loyal man who had taught her to blame the house across the river, because as long as she blamed the river, she would never look at her own accounts. He kept the feud alive, she said at last, very low, to keep me from ever comparing our books with yours. If our houses were at peace, someone would have set the two accounts side by side. He could not allow peace. That is why he was so against the marriage. Not loyalty. Fear. Yes, Richard said. How long have you known? I have not known. I have suspected the suit was a fraud for a year. I did not know whose hand was in your half of it until tonight, with you, at this table. He looked at her. You found it as fast as I did. Faster. You had the wrong figure a week ago. You told me the shape of it just now before I had it clear myself. Whatever else is true, Duchess, do not let this night make you doubt your own competence. You were lied to by a man whose whole trade was your trust. That is not a failure of your understanding. It is a success of his. It was, she thought afterward, the kindest thing anyone had said to her in years, and it had come from her enemy, and it had been true, which was why it helped. She had braced her whole life for the Norbrook cruelty. She had no defence prepared against the Norbrook fairness, and it was taking her apart more surely than any cruelty could. They did not move against Frayne at once. They agreed on that, in the grey dawn, the first thing they ever fully agreed on, that they needed the whole of it before they acted. Every figure, every forged account, or the man would talk his way clear, as he had talked his way clear for 30 years. So they became, without ever naming it, allies. They worked the books together in the evenings, quietly, telling no one. Two people who had married as enemies, bent over the same ledgers, by the same candle. And somewhere in those long, careful evenings, the last of the enmity between them wore away, the way the letters had worn away on the stone. One night, Vivian looked up and found that she was not sitting with the Duke of Norbrook, the enemy of her house, but only with Richard, a fair and lonely and honourable man who was helping her, at cost to no small part of his own dignity, to uncover the theft that had ruined her. And she found that she had begun, without deciding to be glad of his company. The river taught them something the ledgers could not, on the night it rose. It came up in the dark after a week of rain, faster than the low farms had ever known it, and the alarm reached Ravenlair near midnight. There was no time to send for the agent, or to stand on ceremony about whose tenants were whose. Richard was in the yard with a lantern before the message was well delivered, and Vivian was beside him a moment later, in boots and her father's old riding coat. And neither of them thought it strange, because a river does not know the boundary stone, and a drowning family does not care whose master comes. They rode out together into the wild, wet dark, and they worked the low farms side by side until dawn, Netmont ground and Norbrook ground alike, carrying children and driving beasts to high pasture, shoring the weir with sandbags in water to the waist. Vivian gave orders, and Richard took them where she knew the ground better. Richard gave orders, and Vivian took them where his reach was longer, and the tenants of both houses obeyed them both without once asking which house they served, because the water did not ask. By grey morning the low farms were saved, and the weir held, and the two of them stood on the bank, soaked to the bone and shaking with cold and effort, and looked at what they had done together. There was a thing between them then that had not been there before, the particular wordless understanding of two people who have fought the same danger through the same night on the same side. The war did not survive that night. It could not. A quarrel is a thing you keep in the dry and the warm, over ledgers and letters. It does not last long in a flood, with a child under one arm and the enemy's hand hauling you up the bank. It was in the stable afterward, the two of them soaked and cold and waiting for the grooms, that she learned the loneliness of him. He told her a thing he had told no one. He told her that he had wanted, as a young man, before the dukedom fell on him, to do something other than be a duke. He had wanted to build things, canals and drains, and honest works, and the title had closed over that like water over a stone. He had made himself correct and cold, he said, because a man who feels nothing cannot mind the closing. He did not say it for sympathy. He said it the way a man says a true thing once, in the dark, to the one person he thinks will not use it against him. And Vivian, who had spent her life being underestimated, understood exactly what it was to be sealed inside a role the world had assigned you. She did not fill the silence, and she did not offer comfort. She only stood with him in the cold and let him not be alone in it. And it was the nearest either of them had come to tenderness, and neither of them named it. He learned her breaking point in turn, once and only once. It was the day the last of the three farms went, the farm called Closes, the one her father had loved best, foreclosed at last by the men who held the paper, before Richard's clearing of the debts could reach it. A matter of a fortnight's cruel timing. She had held the line for 4 years, and she had lost that farm by 14 days. She went out to the meadow, to the stone, because it was where she went, and she did not know that Richard had followed her at a distance. And she broke there, alone, as she thought, in a way she had never let anyone see. 4 years of held grief coming out of her at last, over a lost field, and a lost father, and a lost brother, and a lost war. And Richard, at the wood's edge, saw it, and understood that he was seeing the thing she had never shown a living soul. He did the hardest thing. He withdrew silently, and let her keep it private, and said nothing of it ever. And he saw to it, quietly, within the month, that the farm called Closes was bought back into the joined estate, and put again into the hands of the family that had always worked it. He never told her he had seen her weep, so that the buying back could be a thing done for the land, and not a thing done in pity for her tears. She found out that he had followed her, and had watched, and had said nothing, only much later. And it was the moment she stopped, entirely being able to think of him as anything but dear. Twice that season the business took them to London, for the suit lived half in the country and half in the law, and the proof they needed was in the law. They went to the chambers where the suit had been bred, in the narrow courts behind the great hall of Chancery, where 60 years of the two houses' money had gone to die. And they asked, as the joined estate now had the right to ask, for the whole of the accounts, every folio, every bill of costs, back to the beginning. The lawyers did not want to give them up. Vivian saw that at once, and so did Richard, and it was the first thing they were certain of, that men do not guard papers so jealously, unless the papers accuse them. But a duke's asking is not easily refused, and the folios came out at last, box upon dusty box. The two of them sat in a cold, panelled room for 3 days, going through them side by side, the Duchess of Norbrook and the Duke, heads bent over the bills, the way they bent over the ledgers at home. And what the London papers showed them fitted exactly, like a key to a lock, with what the country ledgers had begun to show. The suit had never been fought to be won. It had been fought to be continued. Every term brought a fresh flurry of motions that came to nothing and cost a great deal, and the great deal was the point. It had gone, term after term, into bills rendered by a country agent that the London men had queried once or twice long ago, and then stopped querying, because the money came regardless, and it was not their affair to ask whose pocket it truly filled. There were letters in the boxes, old letters, in a hand Vivian knew as well as her own, the careful greying hand of Mr. Frayne, instructing the London men to press on, always to press on, whatever the cost, on the authority of a family too proud and too grieved and too kept in the dark to add up its own bills. The proof was there. It had been there all along, in the open, in a box in a cold room, waiting 60 years for two people from opposite banks of a river to sit down together and read it. They came home with the whole of it copied and sworn, and they came home changed, because 3 days in a cold room over the proof of how thoroughly both their houses had been robbed had done a thing no argument could have done. It had put them, finally and wholly, on the same side. And somewhere in the third day, passing her a folio across the narrow table, Richard had said, "We should have done this 60 years ago, your house and mine." And Vivian had answered, "We could not. That was the whole design of it. We were kept apart, so the books could never meet." They had looked at each other over the dusty box, and understood that the same was true of them, that they too had been kept apart by a design older than either, and that the design was breaking at last. Mr. Frayne knew that his time was running out. A guilty man always knows. He had watched the two of them draw together over the winter, had seen the evenings in the estate office, had marked the way the mistress of Whitecroft no longer sent for him to explain the accounts. And he understood, with the cornered animal's clarity, that the one thing he had spent 30 years preventing had happened. The two houses had made peace, and peace meant the books would be compared, and the comparison would hang him. So he did the thing that desperate men do. He tried to blow the peace apart before it could destroy him, and he reached for his weapon into the one wound old enough and deep enough to serve. He reached for the feud. He came to Vivian, grave and troubled and loyal-seeming as ever, and he told her a story. He told her that he had been going through her late father's papers and had found there the truth of the old quarrel, the real truth, long buried, that the Netmonts had guarded in shame for 60 years. The truth, he said, was that the bride's meadow had been the marriage portion of a Netmont daughter, promised in betrothal to the Norbrook heir 2 generations back. The Norbrook heir had jilted the girl at the very altar, publicly, cruelly, for a richer match. And then, when her family sued for the return of the settled land, he had used his money and his lawyers to keep the meadow he had no right to, and had broken the Netmonts for daring to ask for their own. That was the origin, Frayne said. That was what the Duke's own grandmother knew, and would never tell. And the girl who had been jilted, the girl who had died of the shame of it, unmarried, in a locked room, had been Vivian's own great-great-aunt, and her name had been Vivian too, and Vivian had been named for her, and had never been told why. "Ask him," Frayne said, soft and venomous and certain. "Ask your fine fair Duke about the girl his grandfather ruined. Ask him whose blood is on the meadow he has finally got from you. And then tell me you did right to give it to him with your own hand." It was a masterstroke, and it very nearly worked, because it was built, as the best lies are, on a great deal of truth. There had been a betrothal. There had been a jilting. A girl had died. Vivian had been named for her. And the Duke's grandmother did know a story about it that she had never told. Frayne had only bent the truth by a single degree, at the one point where the whole weight of it turned, and he had chosen his moment with a poisoner's care. He sent Vivian to her husband, white and shaking, the old inherited hatred roused to life again, 60 years of it, at the very hour it had almost died. She confronted Richard in the estate office, among the ledgers that had made them allies, and she flung the story at him, all of it, and demanded to know if it was true. And something happened in his still fair face that she had never seen there before. He did not know the answer, and the not knowing frightened him. "I do not know," he said. "I swear to you I do not know. There was a betrothal. That much I have always known, and that it was broken, and that it is where the quarrel began. But the how of it, and the whose fault, I was never told, only that it was your family's doing, and your family's shame. As you were told, it was mine." He stood very still. "There is one person alive who knows. She told me, before we married, that there was a thing about the beginning she had carried a long time, and would tell me when the moment was right. I think the moment is right. I think we should go and ask my grandmother the truth, together, tonight, and hear it together, whichever of us it damns. And that was the second great turn of the thing, the taller peak of it. They went together, the enemy houses joined in one shaken pair, to the old woman who was the last living witness, and they asked her for the truth. And she gave it to them, all of it, at last. It was not what either of them had been taught, and it was not what Frayne had said, and it broke the feud in a single evening, the way a hard frost breaks at noon. Augusta, Dowager Duchess of Norbrook, heard them out. She was very old and very tired, and she had been waiting 60 years for someone to ask her this in a spirit fit to hear the answer. And she saw, looking at the two white faces before her, the Netmont girl and her own grandson standing not apart but together, that the spirit had come at last. So she told them. There was a betrothal, she said. That much your poisonous steward told you true, girl, for I have no doubt where this came from tonight. A man does not dig up a 60-year grave the week his thefts are about to be found, unless he is digging it to jump into and pull the roof down after him. Yes, there was a betrothal. A daughter of your house, Vivian Netmont, the first Vivian, and the heir of ours, my own elder brother, Edmund. They were promised as children, as the fashion was, to join the two estates and the meadow with them, for the meadow was to be her portion, her bride gift, cut with both their letters on the boundary stone the day the match was made. You have both walked past that stone your whole lives, and been taught it marked a theft. It marked a wedding that both your houses have spent 60 years pretending was a robbery, because the truth was too shaming to either to be borne. She paused, and her old hands worked in her lap. They loved each other, she said. That was the trouble. It was meant to be a match of convenience, and it became the way such things sometimes do, and no one plans, a real one. And then, 3 weeks before the wedding, my brother Edmund fell from a horse on the Norbrook side of the river, and was killed. Not jilted. Killed. He was 23. And here is the thing that neither house has ever been able to say aloud, the thing I have carried since I was a girl of 10 and saw it happen. Both families, in their grief, needed it to be someone's fault. Ours could not bear that it was only a horse and God's hard hand. So we told ourselves the Netmonts had somehow driven him too hard, had wanted the match too much, had killed him with their ambition. And yours could not bear that your Vivian was simply a girl whose love had died under a horse. So you told yourselves the Norbrook heir had jilted her, had never meant to come, had shamed her and stolen her portion, because a villain is easier to hate than a fact. Both lies were built the same night, out of the same grief, over the same two young bodies, for the wedding clothes were already made. The girl did die unmarried in a locked room. That part is true, but she died of a broken heart for a boy who had loved her to the last hour of his life, not of shame for a boy who had wronged her. And the meadow that was to have joined the houses became the ground they fought over instead, and the stone that was cut for a wedding was read by both sides ever after as the mark of a crime. That is the truth. That is the whole of it. Two families who lost the same two children and could not forgive each other for a grief that was no one's fault. 60 years. A fortune. Your farms, girl. My son's whole cold life. All of it, over a horse, and 2 lies told the same night to make the horse bearable. The room was silent for a long time. Vivian wept, then, without shame, and she was not weeping only for herself. She was weeping for the first Vivian, dead of love in a locked room, and for Edmund, who had fallen on the far bank at 23. She was weeping for the 2 houses that had turned a shared grief into a 60-year war, rather than admit that no one was to blame, that the world had simply been cruel, that some losses have no villain and must be borne without one. And Richard, beside her, reached out and took her hand, and she let him. And the 2 worn letters on the stone in the meadow, the N and the P, cut for a wedding and read for 60 years as the mark of a theft, meant in that moment exactly what they had been cut to mean. It was the first time they had meant it since the boy fell from the horse. Frayne knew none of this, Vivian said, when she could speak. He only knew the Netmont lie, the jilting, and he used it. He bent it to break us. He bent it, said the old woman, because the truth would have made peace, and peace would have hanged him. He is the only villain in the whole affair, your Mr. Frayne. 60 years of grief, and not one villain in it until him. And he made himself one for money. Go and deal with him. And then, the pair of you, in the name of God and my brother Edmund, and your poor Vivian in her locked room, stop the war. You are the only 2 people left who can. It ends with you, or it never ends. They dealt with Mr. Frayne within the week, and there was no satisfaction in it, only the sadness the old woman had promised. For when they laid the forged accounts before him, the whole 30 years of it traced and proved, he did not bluster long, he crumpled. He was an old man, greying and soft-spoken, and he wept, and the truth of him came out at last, and it was a small, sad, squalid truth, as such truths usually are. He had begun with a single sum 30 years before, borrowed against a debt he could not pay, meaning to return it. He had not been able to return it. One sum had become another, and the suit had become the place to hide them, and the feud had become the wall that kept the 2 houses from ever comparing the books that would damn him. And he had fed the feud, year on year, decade on decade, not out of any grand malice, but out of the simple animal need of a frightened man to keep from being found out. He had ruined a family to hide a debt. He had kept 60 years of grief alive, so that no one would add up his columns. And now, found out, he was only an old man crying in a cold room, terrified of the jail and the shame, and there was nothing in the sight of him to enjoy, and neither of them enjoyed it. They did not send him to be hanged, though they could have. Richard, at Vivian's asking, arranged it otherwise, quietly. The restitution was taken from what little the man had, and the man himself was turned out to end his days in poverty and obscurity, his crime unpublished, so that the ruin should fall on the guilty man, and not, through a public trial, on the innocent tenants and the Netmont name. It was mercy, of a cold sort, and it was justice, of a sad sort, and it left a mark, as the true resolutions do. And then there were the 2 acts of peace, the ones the old woman had charged them with, and they made them separately, each at cost, as such things must be made. Richard made his first. He could have kept the bride's meadow. It was his now, joined to Ravenlay by the marriage, the thing his grandfather had wanted, the prize of 60 years. Instead, he had the lawyers draw a deed, and he signed the meadow over, whole and outright and forever. He signed it not to the joined estate, but to Whitecroft, to the Netmont name, to Vivian in her own right, and her heirs after her. So the ground that had been cut as a Netmont daughter's bride portion should be a Netmont daughter's again at last, 60 years late. He did it without being asked. He did it expecting nothing. He laid the deed before her one evening. The meadow made hers, the war's whole prize given back across the river with his own hand. And he said only, "It was never ours. It was cut for your Vivian, and it should have been hers. It is yours. Whatever else comes of this marriage or does not come, that at least is put right." And it cost him the one thing 3 generations of his house had wanted, and he gave it away as though it were nothing, because he had come to believe it was nothing, set beside the woman he gave it to. Vivian made hers a week later, and it cost her more, because it cost her pride and her family's face together. She went, alone, to the county assembly, the great gathering of all the families who had watched her married and waited for her to break, and she stood up among them, a Netmont in a Norbrook name, and she told them the truth. She told them the true story of the feud, the whole of it, the horse and the grief, and the 2 lies. And she told them that her own family had been wrong for 60 years, had built a war on a lie to make a grief bearable, had slandered the Norbrook house for the death of a boy no one had killed. She cleared the Norbrook name before the whole county, at the direct cost of her own families. She took the shame of the 60-year lie onto the Netmonts publicly, and set the Norbrooks free of it. She did it because it was true, and because someone had to say it, and because he had given her the meadow, and this was the only thing she had that was worth as much to give back. It was the hardest speech of her life, and she made it in a level voice without once looking away. When she had finished, there was no sound in the room at all. And then old Augusta, who had come, who had insisted on being carried there to hear it, began, alone, to applaud. After a moment, the whole county followed, and the war was over. Both of them had lowered their arms. Neither had merely accepted the other's surrender. Each had given up, separately and at cost, the thing that had been theirs to keep. It was that night, riding home together, under a hard, bright moon, the meadow silver below them, and the stone somewhere in the dark, with its 2 letters, that Vivian first called him by his name. "Richard," she said. It was the first time. She had held to Duke and your Grace and the cold courtesies through all of it, through the ledgers and the flood, and the truth and the deed, because the formality had been the last wall, and she had not been ready to take it down. She was ready now. "Richard, I have to tell you something, and I find I can only say it plainly, because plainness is the only tongue I have. I married you to save my land. I told you so in the church porch, and it was true. But it is not true any longer, and has not been true for some while, and I will not have a lie stand between us now that we have burned every other one. I do not stay for the land. The land is safe. You have seen to that. You gave me the meadow, and cleared the debts, and you asked nothing, and I could leave tomorrow, a free and solvent woman, and you would let me. I know you would. I do not want to leave. I stay because somewhere between the ledgers and the flood, and your grandmother's terrible true story, I stopped being able to imagine a life across the river from you. I stay because I love you. There. It is said. You may do with it what you will. He stopped his horse. In the moonlight, she could not read his face, and for one long moment she thought she had ruined everything, said too much, mistaken respect for a thing it was not. Then he said, and his voice was not steady, which she had never heard. Say it again. The name. I have been the Duke of Norbrook to every soul on both banks of this river for 11 years, and my grandmother is the only living person who calls me Richard, and I have wanted, for longer than I will admit, to hear you say it. Say it again. Richard, she said. I stopped being your enemy, he said. The night you drew up a chair in the estate office and worked the ledgers with me till dawn, and never once said you had told me so. I have loved you since I do not know when, since before I would let myself know it. I married you to stop the bleeding of 2 houses, and I find the only bleeding I care about now is that I have spent months under one roof with the person I love, being scrupulously correct, because I was too proud and too frightened to cross a corridor. I am done being correct. He reached across the space between the 2 horses, the space that was the whole width of the river, and 60 years, and 2 lies. And he took her hand. Vivian, come home. Not to Ravenlair, and not to Whitecroft. Home. There is only the one house now. There was only ever meant to be the one house. Your Vivian and my Edmund knew it before either of us was born. Let us finish what the horse interrupted. And she went home with him. And the war that had eaten 60 years, and a fortune, and too many lives ended. Not at the altar where it might have been merely arranged, but on a moonlit road with 2 enemies calling each other by their names, having each, separately and at cost, laid down their arms. The peace held, because they made it hold deliberately, with their eyes open, every day. That is the only kind of peace that holds. It was not all triumph. The old woman had been right about the cost, and the cost stayed visible, as true costs do. The years were gone, and could not be recalled. The fortune the lawyers had kept was kept still. The farm called closes came back, but the 2 years its family had spent, frightened, did not unhappen. Old Augusta died the following winter, in her bed, having lived, as she said at the last, precisely long enough, and not a season more, having seen the thing she waited 60 years to see. She died reconciled, which the first Vivian and her Edmund never had. That gap between them, the reconciled old woman and the unreconciled young dead, was the exact shape of the sadness the whole story left behind, the thing that had been put right too late for the ones it was first broken over. There was a cost on Vivian's own side, too, and it also wore the face of an old woman. Her father's aunt, old Miss Netmont, the last of that elder generation at Whitecroft, had been raised on the jilting lie as deeply as anyone alive, and she could not, in the end, give it up. She heard the true story, the horse, and the grief, and the 2 lies, and she would not have it. It was easier for her to keep the villain she had hated for 70 years than to accept that there had never been one, that the great grievance of her whole life had been only a grief dressed up as a wrong. She went to her grave the next spring, still calling the Duke a thief, and her niece a traitor for loving him. She was the last casualty of the war, the one it had gone too deep in to be drawn out, and Vivian grieved her, and let her keep her lie, and did not argue at the last. Some people cannot live if you take from them the thing they have hated longest, and it is a cruelty to try. Mr. Frayne died 2 years after, in a lodging in a far town, poor and forgotten. And when the news came, neither of them could feel glad of it. Only the old sadness, the human waste of a man who had ruined a family to hide from a single debt he might have confessed in an afternoon and been forgiven. But there was a child, in time, a daughter. She grew up walking the bride's meadow that was her mother's in her own right, and would be hers after. And she was told the true story of the stone from the first, the horse and the grief, and the two lies and the peace, so that she should carry no catechism of any feud, only the memory of it as a thing her family had once done and had stopped doing, at cost, on purpose. She learned to trace with her small finger the two worn letters on the boundary stone, the N and the P. And she learned to know them not as the mark of a theft, but as what they had always been, cut for a wedding, the wedding of a Vivian and a man of the far house, delayed 60 years by a fall from a horse, and two lies told in grief and kept at last. And on summer evenings, the Duke and Duchess of Norbrook walked out together to the low end of the meadow, to the stone, where the river ran slow, and the ground still kept the print of every winter flood. They stood by the two worn letters that faced each other across the grey face of the stone, no longer divided. And they watched their daughter run in the deep grass of the ground that had been fought over for 60 years, and was only in the end a meadow, rich and green and quiet, a bride's portion at last, joining the two houses exactly as it had been cut to do. The boundary stone marked no boundary any more. There was no longer any line for it to keep. It marked only the place where the war had ended, and the wedding it had been cut for had, in the fullness of a very long time, come true. Thank you for listening to the story all